bits and bones, and welcome to Slady's Quick Reviews, where I share a concise rundown of my thoughts on content that I don't have a whole lot to say about. I'm going to clump my reviews of all three Rupi Kaur's collections into one video because I read them all within the same year. Why did I do that to myself? We'll talk about it after I get through contextualizing how I felt about each one as I went through them. So, first I started with the iconic Milk and Honey, and my original review reads as follows. Reading Milk and Honey was a long time coming, especially since I'm now trying to dabble in poetry more. I gave it a 1.5 out of 5 because I feel like that's the percentage of the book that held any real substance. It's an overdone rant that much of it is insta-poetry, and I knew that going in. I treated those poems as objectively as I could. That said, because they were made to be more generic to suit a short-form platform, they definitely took away from some of the more meaningful longer poems. The difference in length/form of the poems throughout the book lessened any sense of cohesion, which is what I like in a poetry collection. I did not like many of the poem's line breaks, and would have liked to see any use of punctuation to guide readers. The art was minimal, and I can't comment on it as it conveys what it intended. Certain imagery, words, or ideas were repeated too often and became overdone within the collection itself. I cannot complain about the empowerment that Kaur expresses, and I genuinely liked the few longer poems about trauma. As I'm sure you can guess, the healing section was a bit too sappy and redundant for my taste. I'm interested to see how her second book holds up to the first. And now my review for The Sun and Her Flowers, which I read a month or so after, reads as follows. I'm certain that reading both of Rupi Kaur's books in such a short amount of time wasn't the best idea for remaining critical. However, taking them in such close proximity helped make clear the difference between them. The Sun and Her Flowers is a marginally better constructed collection of poetry. As much as I still don't prefer the lowercase line breaks and lacking punctuation, I did notice improvement in the poetry's quality. I was pleased to see the inclusion of many more and much longer poems, some several pages long. Even the insta-poetry seemed better constructed around an image or a feeling than a 1-2 scenario. I was blank, but you were blank. I enjoyed the section and exploration Kaur dedicated to racial identity, and that she branches into her family's stories rather than just her own. My biggest dislike throughout the collection was the overuse of phrases focused on what's between a woman's legs. So The Sun and Her Flowers got a 2.5 out of 5 stars. And lastly, my review for Homebody, which I managed to also read within the year, was this. This was not the collection I expected after The Sun and Her Flowers. There wasn't a poem in this collection that felt poignant or stayed with me after I turned the page. The short-form insta-poetry somehow devolved into single-sentence statements, and the illustrations were much less aesthetically pleasing. I didn't feel the heart in this. Some poems were far too direct. I felt like I was reading blank is bad, period. And as much as I can agree, there was very little exploration on the topics outside of that. And now a word from Present Slady. Since reading Rupi Kaur's collections, I have read a lot more poetry books, and I found that as a whole, they are lower middle tier. I've read worse, I've read better, but as a whole, I feel like poetry collections are just mildly less engaging than I expected them to be. We were raised in school analyzing classical poems, having to pull apart symbolism and nuances, but from what I've experienced of modern poetry, not that much effort is put into them anymore, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'd like to understand what I'm reading without needing to take a full lecture on its layered meanings. For me, a good poem will have an image or an illusion, and deeper layers if you want to bother getting into them, but that is not nearly so convoluted and inaccessible as English class had me to believe. With that in mind, Rupi Kaur's work is very simple, clear, and accessible. Compared to other relative insta-poets I've read like R.H. Sin and Atticus, hers are at the very least telling their own story, albeit a simple one. I am still highly disappointed in Homebody after being so pleasantly surprised with The Sun and Her Flowers. It felt like a cop-out when Kaur had been heading into a deeper, more developed direction, but alas. I'll be keeping my scores of all three works the same. My opinions of them hasn't lightened or dampened that much over time. They were just something to read and never look back to. So, take that as you will. As always, thank you so much for watching. Special thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support me and my content, there will be a link to my Patreon in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!